Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. We always try and find people inside and outside the world of HR to bring you the latest on what's happening and what you need to pay attention to. Today, we have two phenomenal guests, two brilliant guests. First, my colleague from Salary.com, Rebecca Gorman, who's a VP of Compensation Consulting. Hello, Rebecca.
Hello, David.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm very good.
Good.
We have another special guest, though, Rebecca. We have Jeff Higgins, who's the founder and CEO of HCM. Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Hey, David, I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
We are happy to have you as well. So why don't you start us off and give us a little bit about your background and what is HCM?
Sure. HCM is short for Human Capital Management Institute. And that's actually how we started out as a training and consulting organization. Today, we have advanced predictive analytics software called Solve, but we're not here to talk that much about that today. Interestingly, my prior background, I kind of ended up in HR by accident. I grew up in accounting and finance, ultimately as a controller, VP of finance, and CFO as an initial career, and then was in between jobs at one point in a publicly traded bank holding company reached out and said, would you like to work in HR? And I said, no, of course not. But they got me to come in for an interview, and all their top management were MBAs and CPAs. And during the interview process, I said, look, they wanted me to run compensation. I'm like, okay, it's numbers. I can do that, but I don't speak HR. And they all laughed, literally at different interviews and said, well, exactly. We don't speak HR either. So can you present this HR data a little bit more like financial statements in a business case so that we can make sense of it and make better decisions? Sure, give it a try. So they talked me into it and luckily discovered my true passion in life, which is bringing numbers to people. A little bit of detective work, a little bit of accounting work, and lots of learning about HR. So that's how I ended up in HR. And again, all my finance colleagues thought I was nuts, but discovered my true passion in life and have been doing it now for more than 20 years.
Wow. That sounds very much like my origin story, but I didn't start in finance. We do love our finance colleagues. They don't necessarily love us all the time, as you know, Jeff, but we love them. Rebecca, can you give a little bit of background on yourself?
Yeah, so I have kind of an interesting background landing me in the compensation space. I actually majored in French and history and went to graduate school in history, but then decided that I didn't want to be in academia. So I started doing investment and economic research and ended up at the Hay Group doing HR research. And from there, I flowed into the consulting world, and I've worked at some firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mercer, and Towers. And then also I've been on the inside running total rewards for some companies. So I've been on both sides of the fence.
That's very cool. And so both of you will bring interesting perspectives to our topic. But before we get there, Jeff, what's one fun thing that no one knows about Jeff?
Both of my parents were teachers. I decided early on that was the last job I would ever do because I saw how they're, and the public school, so high school teachers.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
So I'm like, boy, if there's one job I'll ever do, it won't be that one. And so I spent my whole life running away from that. Long career in accounting and finance. We just talked about, HR analytics and what I do. And lo and behold, I was told many times, including when I was literally in the military, I became a trainer for certain things in the military. I said, you're good at this teaching thing. And I'm like, oh, not what I wanted to hear. And lo and behold, 30 plus years later, I'm an adjunct professor at USC teaching analytics. So
what do you know?
The moral of the story is if you're good at something or it's in your future, no matter how far you run, you're going to end up there somehow.
There seems like there's a Godfather quote in there somewhere.
You can run, but your destiny will find you.
Right.
That's a good thing, I guess.
No, it is.
I mean, could you?
It's also genetic, isn't it? I mean, that's purely genetics.
Well, I was
apparently.
Patience.
So, Rebecca, how about you? What's one fun thing that no one knows about Rebecca Gorman?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I don't know if nobody knows it, but I lived in, I think, 6 states. Grew up in Colorado, went to college in Louisiana, graduate school in Virginia, then lived in Maryland, also in Massachusetts. So lived a lot of places.
You are definitely a melting pot of the
Yeah,
entirety
exactly.
almost the entirety of the breadth of the U.S.
Right.
Well, also, we could say that you speak all different time zones.
Exactly. Yes, indeed, actually.
And there you are. So we're definitely going to call you when we're not sure what time it is.
All right. Fair enough. I'll be here for you.
Thank you. So today's topic is quite fun. And for those of us who are geeks for executive compensation and for disclosures, this is going to be one for you. So there are potential rule changes coming, and there are groups within the SEC, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, that are putting together proposed rulemaking around HCM metric disclosures. And so today's topic is potential changes to the SEC rules regarding HCM metric disclosures and why they matter to you. So our first question, and I'm going to put this out to Jeff and Rebecca, you can dive in there too. What are some of the rule changes suggestions that groups have made regarding HCM metric disclosures?
Hey there, I'm Tim Boris, host of the Working Well podcast, where business strategy meets human sustainability. If you're an executive, a leader, or change maker ready to ditch burnout, build thriving teams, and drive real results, this is your next must listen. Tune in on the Work Defined Network or at timboris.com/podcast.
Oh, that's a great question. And I'll try to boil it down to a really short answer. Really going back to 2017, a group of institutional investors petitioned the SEC and said, hey, CEOs and companies are all telling us how great their talent is. Hey, our people are our most valuable asset, right. Such a commonly used phrase by CEOs. And yet nothing has been reported. So we buy into that, but now we want more disclosure. And oh, by the way, companies increasingly in their risk section of their reporting or their 10K, 10Qs, they list all these human capital risks. We can't find people. We can't retain people. Right. We can't pay them properly. We have other kinds of problems. Diversity has become an emerging issue and opportunity for organizations. And yet almost nothing is disclosed publicly by the companies. They use a lot of flowery language, but there's no data. And so SEC or investors, institutional investors, really the customers of the SEC, have been pushing for that. And so the SEC actually did something in 2020. They issued a new rule and said, hey, we're going to, people are material, but companies, you decide. It's a principles-based approach. You decide what needs to be reported. Not much was. And the institutional investors made some recommendations, and they're still working at it today. So interestingly, I'll pick on my former career, finance and accounting. They're never early to any party. You can count on them not to be the first to the party. Right. They have finally, pretty much almost a decade after this started, they actually petitioned in 2022, the SEC, for detailed rules and breakdown on headcount, workforce, and labor cost. And the reason they said it's, biggest cost for most companies, and it's not disclosed, it's kind of buried in all the other numbers. And they gave a great, accounting argument for that, which I think the SEC really heard well. And we think that's going to influence what they're likely to come out with soon. Not to spoil it, but actually, we think there's actually the SEC has sort of shared enough of their hands through one of the subcommittees called the IAZ Investor Advisory Committee of what they're likely to put out.
Rebecca, did you want to comment on, what those might be?
So I would just say that the Financial Accounting Standards Board had put together a proposal that was a little bit more detailed than the 2020 rule that the SEC put in place. So asking for a little bit more detail around what should be disclosed. As Jeff said, it was, you have to disclose something, but what you disclose is up to you. That's pretty much the 2020 rule. Right. And the FASB took it a little bit further. And then the subcommittee, the Investor Advisory Committee of the SEC said, no, FASB isn't going far enough. We really need to specify what should be disclosed. And those things are what Jeff listed with an additional item. And that additional item is the actual cost. Or, actually 2 additional items. One is the cost, breaking down what are you spending on people and what are you spending on the different elements of pay. Then also The second major bucket that they were suggesting is a narrative in the 10K that's similar to what's in the CDNA of the proxy that talks about what is your compensation philosophy and how does it align with your business strategy. So that's what the IAC has suggested.
Isn't that going to be a wake-up call for many companies who actually don't really have a very well thought through compensation philosophy, especially one that's more modern, that takes transparency into perspective? I know that's kind of a sub point here, but isn't that going to kind of challenge them a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these things together, pay transparency, pay equity, which you mentioned. So what's going on in the States in terms of legislation,
right.
That's a wake-up call. This kind of requirement would be a wake-up call because you don't want to be caught flat-footed with nothing to say in your disclosure. On the other hand, there's this push-pull between the SEC and institutional investors wanting more disclosure and businesses saying, hey, wait a minute, we have the right to maintain competitive advantage around our business strategy, and disclosing all of these things is giving our competitors information or inside information that's fundamental to how we do business and how we operate. And so we shouldn't be required by a governmental or regulatory agency to tell our competitors how we're doing this. So the tendency for businesses is to disclose as little as they have to and still meet the requirement. And the tendency for institutional investors is to demand more information.
Well, when I used to do exec comp, we used to call that obfuscation. We used to do the best we could to hide crap. And, especially when we were talking about what were the grants and what year was it for. And,
yes.
But so let's talk a little bit about that and talk about, so what is the rule potentially going to be? Or what would the rules look like? And then, do the companies really have any wiggle room in order to be able to not satisfy these?
Oh, I would love to jump on that. And Rebecca, I loved your comment with the perspective of companies. And by the way, to be fair, as a former CFO, I was never looking for more disclosure work anyway, right? Who's going to vote for more work, right?
Anybody's
Nobody.
written proxy, right. Exactly.
Nobody. So I get that. But honestly, I would have been super uncomfortable making the argument that many of these companies have made that you stated, which is, we have a right to hide. This is competitive advantage. This is intellectual property. This is secret sauce. We should not be required to disclose, more details on our pay or pay practices or what our turnover rate is or how many people we have by major job category or group. And that argument, I think that was a great argument, I think, in like 1990. So I would say most of these companies, have they ever heard of this thing called the internet? How about Glassdoor.com or LinkedIn? By the way, people could reverse engineer your org chart through LinkedIn if they really want to. So most of this information that companies think they're obfuscating and hiding, investors and others are getting to pieces of it. And the real problem, I heard a great quote from an institutional investor who was literally in the room having an argument with a large public company. And actually the head of Comp and Ben for a large publicly traded company said, look, we're never going to do this. We don't care. We just consider this too sensitive. You'll have to live on what's out there. And so the institutional investor representative said, oh, so you want us to make, thumbs up or thumbs down decisions based only on Glassdoor and what we can pull off of Facebook commentary,
right,
in social media. And that's what you want us to make judgments about your company and how you manage your talent. And he's like, no, that's not really what I said. So there was some immediate backtracking because honestly, I think there's more opportunity. I know companies are scared about it, but there's more opportunity, more upside than downside, because by disclosing more, you have a chance to kind of set the record straight and grab the narrative to tell that story in a positive way. Even if you have high attrition, you can say, look, we're a training ground. We bring people in young, we invest in them, we train them, and then, they go off and do great things elsewhere. Well, there's nothing wrong with that story at all. And by the way, you've just explained a high attrition rate.
Right. And that's the business model that many companies have been in, like the consulting firms forever.
Right.
And investment banks too.
Right.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
To get back to the point, the CFO doesn't want more work. The compensation and benefits people kind of don't understand. In this case, they may not even understand the gravity based on that question.
Right.
So whose lap is this going to fall into to be able to actually start to build these responses and to actually be the people who are kind of stepping forward to be able to say, we've got this, we're going to give it to you. Is it HR? Is it finance? Is it investor relations? Who's going to do it?
Well, so I can weigh in on that from being on the inside running total rewards, and Jeff can speak from the CFO perspective. But in terms of, mid-cap companies and larger, so maybe not recently IPO'd small firms who are public, but companies who've been around the block in terms of filings, usually you have a triumvirate in your filings. You have legal, finance, and HR. And so legal leads the charge in terms of this is what we've got to get in there. And finance is gathering all the numbers related to financial analytics that aren't HR related. And then HR cobbles together or collects the data. I shouldn't say cobbles together. That sounds negative. Gathers the data that's required, for example, in the proxy statement. So these specific items would come from the HRIS and would come from probably total rewards with some help from HR. But David, that's a great question, because I think that's one of the things that gives organizations pause, in that it is a huge investment of time on HR's part, at least, to prepare these things. Like the amount of time and money that it takes to just do CEO pay ratio is significant. And so in terms of having the staffing, the know-how, all of that, to be able to fulfill these requirements is significant. And so it's not just as if the data is sitting around to be put into a document. It's got to be gathered. It's got to be presented in a way that makes sense. So it's a big time-consuming process, and that's part of the reason there's pushback. And I'm not saying good or bad. I'm just saying if businesses have a finite amount of resources, do they really want to spend it on disclosure, or do they want to spend it on something more strategic in their view?
Well, they can't get around it. They're going to have to actually disclose these things or face what Jeff was talking about, which is the wrath of their investment community, right?
Well, potentially. I mean, the rule, I do note that it's the end of October and they haven't put out the rule yet. It hasn't been finalized because there is a raging battle. And Jeff, maybe I'm overstating, maybe I'm characterizing it a bit more strongly, but I think there is a battle between institutional investors and what they want to see, and businesses saying, hey, wait a minute. You did this to us with CEO pay ratio, and nobody thinks CEO pay ratio is a worthwhile metric now, in hindsight, although it's a lot blurrier or grayer on how you get to it. These metrics, I think, are pretty straightforward. But we've spent all this time and money doing CEO pay ratio every year, and everybody agrees that it's not really a very helpful metric. So are you really going to ask us to do this, to invest this much resource in this disclosure, only to find in a few years that it's not really helping? So, I mean, they'll have to if it gets implemented, of course. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I love that. And by the way, back to one of your earlier comments, Rebecca, I totally agree that with the term you use when HR is in the room for the triumvirate, I think cobble is actually the perfect term. Because I think, and I would argue that HR is often in the room nominally at best. When I was in comp for the publicly traded organization, my advice was sought almost none. I basically provided a couple of spreadsheets, and that's it. I would only get called in the room if there were any questions. Right. And,
the proxy statement?
Yep.
Oh,
and I mean, and of course, now, and this was back a while. This was pre, CEO pay ratio, which, by the way, the funny thing, I was totally against that. It's like, why do we lead with the stupid metric instead of the smart ones?
Exactly.
Right. So it obviously has not done any favors or earned any credibility for the SEC or investors. But in the long run, you can't bet against investors because arguably they own these public companies, so they are going to get their way. It's just a matter of time. And I think the SEC, because of the 2020 rule and the response of companies was pretty bad, meaning, all right, companies, you decide, people are mostly material. By the way, you can choose to say that people are not material. I don't think any public company's ever done that because that would be really bad. But they say you decide what the material metrics are and you report them. And the additional disclosures have been almost nil, with the exception of diversity, which was already a movement that was taking shape. Right. So companies have not stepped forward to offer up anything, and I think that was also a very poor move on their part, and individual. And I agree, and I understand why you coined it really well. If legal leads the party, hey, let's disclose nothing new because anything we disclose could have risk. So let's keep risk as low as we can. Unfortunately, there's already a ton of risk. You can't include in your reporting and your proxies all these stated risks in your list of risks. for your disclosures, and they have all this boilerplate, great risks on people, and no metrics about how you're managing or mitigating any of those risks. So you can't state a risk and then absolutely hide everything about it. And I think what the SEC proposal would be, which is really just 4 areas: turnover, headcount, labor cost, and diversity, maybe something on like internal hires or promotions, is frankly really good basic information that most companies have. And so I don't know that the cost will be that prohibitive. And certainly, if anything, it should put CEO pay ratio back in its place, which is a lesser metric that people shouldn't be relying on, because this other information would give far greater insight. And I think that's just going to be table stakes going forward, particularly when you consider, where all the value is created by people today. 10 people in a room with good internet can be the next unicorn billion-dollar company going public. Right. And you didn't have that when earlier SEC rules and Reg SK was created. It was all manufacturing and industrial.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, are you listening to this and thinking to yourself, man, I wish I could talk to David about this? Well, you're in luck. We have a special offer for listeners of the HR Data Labs podcast. A free half-hour call with me about any of the topics we cover on the podcast or whatever is on your mind. Go to salary.com/HRDL consulting to schedule your free 30-minute call today. So based on that, and let's just say and assume that the SEC does eventually adopt these suggestions, what can companies do now to actually prepare? Like you say, maybe it's some specific metrics, but what can they do to prepare to get ready for that?
Well, I'm happy to take a quick cut at that, because it's, by the way, at the end of the day, and it does list in the IAC recommendation a 5th item, which I would argue is actually the most important. And you already touched on it, Rebecca, which is the narrative. And that's where compensation can really play a role. But I would say no dilly, no do it like last year. You can't use the same statements, because if you're going to disclose all this, it means there are going to be more numbers to hold the organization accountable. It's some of the flowery language they use may have to be cut back, or it's going to have to be consistent with the data that gets reported. And what companies can do specifically, one, besides tracking, making sure you track and report all this stuff already. So you build your story, because having the numbers is only half the battle. The other half is the story. That's going to be the piece that takes a little time. What's actually happening here, and how can we craft a reasonable and hopefully positive story out of it? Or, hey, it's just not going well, but we're working on it, right? Because I don't think anyone is going to just all of a sudden say dump the company's stock because they're not doing particularly well in one metric or another. It's really just a starting point. In fact, you might almost say it's a pass your first year, is get the information out there. And if it's bad, and next year you think you can easily, low-hanging fruit, you can improve it. You can look great in the next year or the next, a few quarters down the road. And lastly, I'd say if you're looking for a way to reduce risk, I'm going to bring in another piece of compliance out there, which is, if you want to reduce risk, don't make up your own metrics and don't get super creative, because I think that is, that's exactly what legal doesn't want to see happen, is getting creative with these kinds of metrics. And I don't think the SEC is going to give you everything you need to do this. They're going to say, here's what you need to report, but they're not going to write a book and issue it, which would be, I guess, ideal or terrible, depending on your perspective. So there's another regulatory tool out there that was created by the ISO, the International Organization for Standards, called ISO 30414. It's a document that can be purchased for about $125, because ISO is a nonprofit, and it's how to measure and report workforce internally and externally. And it's got 60 odd metrics in there. So if you're looking for a great tool, and it will reduce risk, because if you say we're following this ISO set of rules and guidelines, that way nobody's going to come back and say you got, you played fast and loose with any of your metrics or your definitions and terms, because you could reference that.
They already have metrics that are built into their HCM. So if they're going to the ISO standards, well, hopefully they're actually the same standard in their same calculation as in the HCM. But that would kind of be a little bit more re-engineering and probably cost a lot of money to do. Wouldn't you suggest that they start with the tools that are at their fingertips and not have to reinvent the wheel?
Absolutely. But I think we're giving a lot of credit to the HCMs if we assume that they have any these kind of metrics ready to come off. In fact, my big complaint when I was in HR, when I crossed finance to HR, I had an eye-opening awakening, which is I said, hey, where's kind of the guidebook on HR for how we measure and report the workforce? And they said, oh, here's the employee handbook. And I'm like, no, I don't want to know how many days off I get or what the benefits policy is. How is all this stuff measured and reported? What's the standard? And they said, oh, we don't have anything like that. Right. So there really hasn't been anything. And this ISO standard is only 5 years old. Most companies don't know about it or use it. And I would argue most of the HCM providers would just say, oh, well, we have 150 custom reports you can run, but none of them are actually going to give you ISO compliant metrics or really do a fair job of what the SEC is likely to recommend. It's based on ad hoc type things over the years. And of course, every company, 10 reasonable companies could probably come up with 10 different ways to measure turnover.
Yeah, I would be very worried about those metrics and the ability for us to make sure that the story's straight with finance. So the data from your HRMS needs to be in complete sync with the finance systems as well as the supply chain systems, so that when you're saying something on one page, the investors don't look at the other page and go, wait a minute, you said your total spend on talent is this, but your finance people just put a table over here that's not the same.
Oh, yeah.
And David, you've just presented the big elephant in the room that is a huge issue for particularly large issuers. So in my point of view is that SEC is very U.S. centric because it regulates U.S. issuers. And so when they put together rules, it focuses on organizations almost as if they are strictly U.S. companies. But when you have large global companies that are U.S. issuers having to comply with this, and they've got thousands of employees and maybe most of their employees are overseas.
That's right.
And of course, here I'm being U.S. centric by saying that. But if you've got 20,000 employees in India and 500 in the U.S., but you're a U.S. issuer, and you're reporting your metrics and you're reporting numbers for your rewards, it's going to look weird compared to an organization that's maybe a competitor of yours that's strictly U.S. based.
That's correct.
So, are we including the 13th month for countries that have a 13th month?
Yeah.
Are we including the fact that the government provides healthcare in some countries and not others? So all of these statistics and metrics that they're looking for is very discrete and clear, perhaps, to a U.S.-based company. But just like with CEO pay ratio, it gets really confusing when you're talking about companies that are global.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, you mentioned this before, and I think, Rebecca, you may have as well, that starting out, and the reason why we're talking about this now is we're trying to say, where should you start and how do you prepare? Starting out, you need to have assumptions laid out very clearly. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about the U.S.? Are we talking global? What is this in relationship to? And getting back to what Jeff said about the narrative, making sure the narrative plays and making sure the narrative holds together when you read the rest of the report.
Yeah.
That has not been our core competency.
And with the narrative, your compensation philosophy is likely to be different in different, it might be demographically based or otherwise. And then one other thing that I just, is food for thought that maybe Jeff would have an answer to is that we think of a lot of the HR reporting and compensation reporting as being in the CD&A as part of the proxy statement of the DEF 14A. These metrics will be reported in the 10K, which is an audited filing. And so my question for Jeff would be, would this piece have to go to the outside auditor and be audited? In which case, that's an entirely another ballgame. Or is it something that's unaudited?
Great question. I think eventually it will be auditable.
Okay.
But if there were an area where organizations could punt a little bit to maybe buy themselves more time, it would probably be there. I know that the some of the rule proposal outlines do recommend putting it in the 10K, but a lot of companies today are issuing a people report, an ESG report, an integrated report. Right. And so I think companies could make a very good argument that, hey, we're going to put this information not in our 10K, and by the way, sidestep the auditing for a while. We're going to put this in our ESG or our integrated reporting because that's aligned with the other kind of similar information that we're already reporting, and make a reasonable argument for that. I also think that you're absolutely right about some of the risks. And another one I want to bring up, which I think is going to be the scary. In fact, from what I've heard talking to companies, two things I've always heard. Jeff, we'll worry about this when it happens. So most companies absolutely are either blissfully unaware or intentionally being unaware about it. So they're not a lot of prep going on. And two, what I've heard is the greatest fear metric based on the proposal by the SEC is no longer turnover. It used to be turnover because it's a failure metric, right? It's hard to look good when you're losing people. Everybody loves working for us. Well, then why do 33% of your staff turn over every year? So, but right. there are ways to manage that. The one that's scaring, I think, organizations today is contingent labor. So can you imagine how are you going to explain in your narrative that this is a strategically valuable exercise that you're doing, that 50% of your workforce is contingent?
Well, and if they have the data, to Rebecca's point before, thinking globally.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, we have a lot of companies that are using third-party labor to put their stuff together, a la Apple. How do they fit in?
Right. That's a TBD. I don't know that the SEC is going to even get to that. That will be a big question that will come up.
Well, I think, and this is just a hunch, Jeff, but I think that it's, you don't want to be exposed for relying on contingent labor alone, but also given the rules that came along with the ACA, with the Affordable Care Act and the requirements of offering benefits to contingent laborers after they've worked a certain number of hours for your organization. Many organizations are going to be like, yeah, we know we really should have made them actual FTEs at some point, but we didn't. And that basically exposes them possibly legally that you really shouldn't. If 50% of your workforce is contingent labor, unless you're doing things like farming where you're harvesting and it's seasonal, or retail maybe, then it looks strange that half of your workforce is not benefits eligible.
Well, but then that goes back to the story, right? And, is that accounted for in the story?
Right.
Or could it be?
Right.
And I think what we're going to have to do, because this is an amazing conversation, and I know a lot of people are just very excited now about this. I think what we're going to have to do is come back when we get closer to, or we have the regulation, the rules, and see what they actually turned out to be. And then talk about, well, now what do we do? Because we can prepare now. We can start thinking about it. We can probably start looking at, Jeff's point, the ISO standards, or we can look at what do we have at our disposal that we could go with, and who's going to do it, and get prepared there. But then when the rules come and they're solidified, that's when the rubber's going to have to meet the road. So my suggestion is I'm going to invite you two back later on when we have more of a better understanding for what this rule looks like.
I'd love it.
That sounds great. And by the way, David, my prediction is they're going to issue the rules before the end of this calendar year.
That have to go into effect January 1, right?
Well, no, there'll have to be a comment period.
Response period. Yeah, comment period. There you go.
Right.
So it would be a push, but they could have them effective for 2023 full year reporting, Q2 type, or they could give people a pass and have it phase in for 2025 or something, for 2024 reporting, something like that. But yeah, great comment. We'll have to, and just what companies all want to hear. We'll worry about it when it happens, but that'll be hair on fire.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we've seen that happen too when SK came out, and then there was a relative yawn on that. But this is going to be hopefully more impactful, less biting, but more impactful.
Yeah, my recommendation is to get your data in order, make sure you have a solid HRIS, that your data is clean across systems, because it's tough to report when you don't know who's on first or what's where.
I don't know. Third base. Thank you very much, both of you. It's been a pleasure having you on. And as I said, we're going to have you back once we know what the rule looks like.
Excellent. Enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, David.
Thank you all. Take care and stay safe.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.